Okay, welcome to the panel. We're looking at whether we have a right to be faceless. So I think what we'll do to start is everyone will introduce themselves and give a little bit of information and a background about who they are and what they're going to be talking about. So, Bogomir, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody. What we experienced here right away was a kind of a form of a technology racism, because all of us who are on Mac were suddenly not able to attach ourselves to this computer and either show our files the other way around. So we see how actually technology makes us inclusive or exclusive, or we are here to actually speak about the phenomena that till now is named as faceless. So it started as my personal obsession with collecting of faceless images, especially from 9/11, the rise of images where ordinary people, non-professional artists or artists are actually hiding faces for different reasons. So some of these images have been created directly in a context of a terrorism, an issue of burqa and Islamophobia on one side, and inside this overpresence of surveillance. Some are reaction to just imitation of these images because it's nice when you don't see the face. There's always this tension, erotic tension and fear together. Which is very much used in horror cinema. So what this phenomena is looking at, it looks actually in the explosion of faceless images in online and media world, and tries to understand why these images are produced. So they're produced sometimes in a very different context. And if you think of protests that happen these days, if you think of Pussy Riot, Anonymous, Hong Kong protest, mask plays a very important role in every public gathering. Basically this project started as an exhibition, it grew into a publication, it was feeding different kind of educational programs and symposiums, and it was also announcing something that is called counter-surveillance or resistance of people to show the face. So since we're here discussing of the future of a face, and will AI analyze our faces, should we go for this technology or not, I think it's interesting to show how society already shows this pathology through actually image culture. That's the shortest that I could go. I don't know if it's enough. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So Jeremy,
okay. Hi, I'm famous new media artist Jeremy Bailey, and yes, I also believe each of you are famous new media artists. As an artist, I've always been thrilled about technology, but I'm from a long line of artists who have taken the technology that we perceive as controlling or potentially, overpowering, and turn those technologies upside down and demonstrate their creative potential. So for years, I've been working with stuff like face tracking, some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today on the panel, but in a creative way to demonstrate that we can all be famous. So that's me.
Okay. I'm Kate Bissell. I'm a BBC documentary maker for radio. And I was inspired to make a program for a series called The Digital Human about faceless because of Bogomir's work. And that documentary was picked up, and that was the inspiration for this panel. So that's why we're here. And Shankar.
Good morning, folks. I'm Shankar Narayan. I'm sort of the boring lawyer on a panel of amazing creatives. Although in my other life, I am a poet, and I do write about technological dystopia and the significant questions it forces on us in terms of the boundary between human and animal and divine, right? There are a lot of really interesting questions that go with that. But in my lawyerly life, I think my relevant experiences, I started out my professional career working for big tech. So I was a technology lawyer. I worked for Microsoft, for Amazon, a whole bunch of other startups that went belly up. I then worked in immigrant rights as an organizer and a political policy person, and came to the American Civil Liberties Union about 11 years ago. First as their legislative director, which I think was relevant because I think it gave me an appreciation of just the inequity and disproportionality that's evident in virtually all of our brick and mortar systems, right? Whether it's the criminal justice system, whether it's medicine or reproductive health, whether it's immigrant rights, right? These inequities infect all of the data that comes out of those systems, and therefore it's not surprising that the technology we build on top of those systems often not only reflects but actually amplifies those biases, right? And then I sort of came full circle about 4 years ago. I took on the job of Technology and Liberty Project Director. And in that work, I think my basic premise has been this idea that technology doesn't impact everyone equally, right? And sometimes the costs of technology are actually borne by different people than the benefits of technology. So, over the last couple of days in this conference, you've heard a lot about, the benefits of facial recognition or the convenience of facial recognition. But we haven't really broken down who is going to bear the costs of facial recognition. And as it turns out, every technology is released within this matrix of power where people who are historically marginalized or vulnerable often bear a disproportionate share of the costs, right? We have a long list of surveillance technologies for which that's true, and I believe that with facial recognition, it's going to be no different. I left the ACLU on January 1st. My new project is called Create Our Future, and the idea there is to empower communities to have the language to be able to engage in this discussion about how technology impacts them.
Okay, thanks. And at the end we have Marco and Jason. Do you want to introduce yourselves?
Okay.
Just briefly tell them where you're from.
I'm Marco. I'm from Hong Kong. Sorry for covering ourselves to protect our identities. No disrespect to the conference as well as all the audience, but it certainly emphasizes and echoes to the theme of the session that how important it is for the people to be faceless. I joined the social movement in Hong Kong as a protester as well as a delegate in Birmingham stands with Hong Kong and in the UK. So I'm going to share some first-hand information regarding the use of technology and surveillance in Hong Kong as a city under the rule of China in the perspective of a Hong Kong citizen and as well as a student who studies policy, politics and economics in the UK. In fact, the large number of CCTV installed in the city has been paramount and it caught the attention of the Hong Kong citizens as well as the globe, and I will pay attention or I'll pay more detail in the session. And I'd also work for Hong Kong Red Cross on automatic weapons under the legal framework of international humanitarian law. So I have profound kind of knowledge in the international law and the international system, how the legal framework and to a certain extent constrain the use of automatic weapons in war crimes. Yes, thank you.
Hi, I'm Jason, and I'm Hong Kong protesters. And again, sorry for covering our face because in order to protect our identity. And I'm currently now studying in the UK, same as Marco. And as a Hong Kong protesters, which is one of the frontliners that we may claim. I hope to share some first-hand experience of how we face the facial recognition or face the AI. And we can our feelings on these systems when we are protesting or yep.
Okay, thanks. So we're going to start with looking at evidence out there as to whether we're trying to or wanting to redefine our privacy and become faceless. So Bogomir, do you want to start?
Yeah, I actually kind of try to sum up everything in a few sentences, so I will just pick on some points. For me, what's interesting, so I'm coming from an angle of art and research, so it's to look into images and why they're produced and what they're communicating, because till now we all agree that visual language is something that historically is quite important for for us. And yeah, so basically just by trying to categorize in what kind of context these images are produced, I would then shape the project Faceless. And for me, what was important was to understand that the amount of these images is not just few artists. So we are not talking about well-selected top few artists. We're talking about thousands of artists, not even being original, but producing these images over and over. So when you print them out or when you put them in one exhibition space, you're surrounded by these faceless images, and it feels quite uncanny and uncomfortable. So it is a sign of some kind of social political restlessness. And we're talking about period from 2004 till now, so it's already like 16 years. What was also interesting to see is that what the artists were playing and experimenting with, and one of them is also Jeremy Bailey, so what was kind of experiment with technology and use of technology and creating of work did create some kind of ideas of how one could reinvent him or herself in this kind of system, but it also offers some kind of a base for development of a counter-surveillance and practices. And I actually would really like to give mic to Jeremy. For me, what was interesting, you know, I'm sure most of you tried the face filters on your phone, and those who didn't, maybe you have kids or you have somebody in your surroundings. So what's interesting about these face filters is that they are now so overly populated and shared. And we all have this chance to try different gender, to try different age. So they play with our insecurities, taboos, and fears. Fear of death in case of aging, trying different gender in case of sexual insecurities or restlessness, or kind of not daring to drag yourself in real life. This kind of digital mask became also a norm of behaving. So yeah, Faceless was also somehow looking into that. But yeah, maybe Jeremy, you can take over. I will try to play your files while you're speaking.
Sure. Yeah, so like I think as Bogomir said, I'll just offer a little bit of historical perspective, because you know we're obviously talking about face tracking technologies. We think all this stuff's like super new and exciting, but really historically speaking, it's like it's a continuation of a pattern or a cycle where technology that belonged in the hands of the few sort of gets democratized. And the term democratization is actually problematic, but ultimately what ends up happening is when these technologies get into the hands of the many, and oftentimes those early many are artists, the initial impulse is to misuse those tools to create power for expression, right? So the best example, at least in my lifetime, that I've studied is coming out of post-war. Oh, that's me talking. Is it?
Scott
Oh,
married.
the video.
That's
We're
sorry,
supposed
no
to be on
sound,
honeymoon,
please.
But of course,
Yeah. So in the
curator.
yeah, we can turn those. Okay. In like the 1960s, if you wanted to have your face on television, you either had to murder someone or maybe be a politician, but really you had to be a part of the news media or famous. But then in the late 1960s, Sony came out with a revolutionary device. It actually ended up being the most successful consumer electronics device up until that point in history. And there's lots of those over history, but it broke all the records, and it was this thing called the Sony Portapack, and it was just a portable video camera. But video cameras had been like $50,000 prior to that point. Anyway, it unleashed a revolution in the arts of people, you know, getting their hands on this technology and really unpacking what it meant. But what was really exciting to people from that time was, like I said, they finally had access to the means of production, and in that case, that production, it had produced a lot of inequality, right? So when we talk about inequity and who these technologies serve, if you were a woman prior to like 1970, you had not seen your image represented in the media in a way that felt legitimately real, right? So taking on that technology creatively was an act of liberation, and so there's a lot of feminist video that comes out of that time. Now, all kinds of groups got their hands on this, and getting access to technology actually ended up being a political thing throughout the 1980s in America, especially with cable access movements. And now we end up today with like a technology stack. The question I ask anyway as an artist is, if that video camera was the beginning of a revolution in owning our own image and taking back control over the social constraints that are in a lot of ways not always technological, they're societal, or they're even built into our economies. and we're inverting those today. The problem probably is that the technologies are getting so complex. So for me, when I first asked this question, what's changed about the camera? This was like in the early 2000s. The camera was now a computer. It was a web camera, and it was tied to software. And I started performing in real time with software. And when Bogomir says like, I was doing stuff early on with face filters, is because I was just taking software that people were writing in the open source community coming out of universities, like a lot of the people in this room probably, and playing with that software and seeing what it could do. Eventually that software ended up in the hands of companies like Snapchat and Facebook, Instagram, and they revolutionized the face filter movement. But I actually had a call with Snapchat when I was doing this type of work, and they're super inspired by what you're doing, Jeremy. I have a video where I turned my wife into a unicorn, or my partner. And they're like, Jeremy, can you imagine a world where we're all just sitting around as unicorns or whatever we want to be? Isn't that going to be incredible? And actually, I do agree it would be incredible. But the call ended when they're like, and we'll own it all, really, because they wanted to own all of my intellectual property in that regard. But their vision of the future was also just like, it's interesting. So what if our identities end up being tied to platforms? And I think that's also maybe where I can hand off somewhat. But I do think identity politics and capitalism intersect right now in a very interesting way as a form of social control.
So I'll share some of my observations. I've sort of been on the front lines of this debate in the United States about the widespread use of facial recognition, which I call face surveillance, because it's of course not just about recognition. And I'm sort of taking that particular technology as a microcosm for a much broader set of technologies that makes it more difficult for people to live their lives, in what we might call a state of libertarian freedom, right, where you are able to move around in society, make transactions anonymously, move in public places anonymously, and engage in constitutionally protected activity, right, like speech, like protest, like going to your place of religion, et cetera, et cetera. And the premise of this panel is this question of whether we have the right to remain faceless. I'm not particularly interested in I could have the legal debate, right, about whether we have, right, under the Constitution or EU fundamental rights, the right to remain faceless. But I think the more important point is, in my view, we should have the right to remain faceless, right? That there is something fundamentally important to a free society and to a democratic society about this idea of being able to engage in these constitutionally protected activities in an anonymous way. And with widespread face surveillance in particular, there are fundamental questions about whether this a particularly widespread deployment of face surveillance in public spaces is compatible with a free and democratic society at all, right? We have had, as I mentioned, all of these examples of surveillance technologies that have been used to impact the most vulnerable communities, right? Japanese Americans and I'm using US-based examples, but you can pull others out of different contexts. But the Japanese American incarceration in the US was back-ended by the technology of the day, which was a census technology called the Hollerith machines, right, which were punch card machines. And they were supposed to be used for the census, but in this case, right, an emergency was declared, and suddenly this supposedly benign use had mission crept into an extremely efficient way to round up people of Japanese descent in America who found it very difficult to escape the net of this incarceration. Every black civil rights leader had a dossier that was back-ended by the tools of the day, bugging, infiltration, even a form of fake news where they would send fake letters from one civil rights leader to another, right, to foment disagreement between them. All the way up to modern day and social media monitoring of the Black Lives Matter movement and Occupy Wall Street. The list goes on. And I think, in the case of face surveillance, we have both a substantive and a process problem. And I think the process problem is one that reflects the way technology is often deployed, and surveillance technologies in particular are often deployed in the modern context, which is A technology vendor creates a system. It is sold to a government agency without a lot of transparency, without the opportunity for public elected decision makers to ever even understand the capabilities of the system, let alone say no to it. And certainly the electorate, right, and even more particularly those marginalized and vulnerable communities never have an opportunity to say no to that technology. And I think, for my money, where, I would have liked to see more discussion on the face surveillance panels about this question is, about this on face surveillance is, should we have the opportunity to say no? I would say yes. And as it turns out, in some of the polling we've done, there's often these arguments that people want face surveillance for the convenience of being able to move around in public, et cetera, et cetera. It turns out that when you actually talk about how giving up this immutable biometric might come back to impact their lives in the future, right? How that data may spread to various government agencies and make it possible, for example, to identify them in a protest. The willingness to exchange convenience actually sort of flips, right? So, the before number is about 2/3, 1/3, and it actually flips to 2/3, 1/3 against the technology once that additional information is given. So I just want to take a quick minute and set up. I think it's worth reminding ourselves the specific reasons why face surveillance, I think, is a threat to democracy when it's used in this widespread public manner, right? First, of course, is it's based on an immutable biometric. You can't change your face, or at least it's very difficult to change your face. And once your face print is in some database, it's there, right? And it's always linked to you. Second, it's not just about ID, right? We shouldn't make that fallacy. It's also about location tracking in virtually every public space, and about affect recognition, right? This idea that you can analyze someone's face and determine their propensity for dangerousness, how angry they are, how happy they are, right? This links this conversation back to a very long line of discredited science, right? When it was science that was saying, well, the size of your head or the shape of your nose determines how intelligent you are, we debunked that. But because this is analytics, right, this is just correlation and not causation, we're much more willing to accept it. And there are companies right now selling tools that purport to analyze your face and tell you whether a person has terrorist proclivities, right? So that seems deeply problematic to me. Third, it's biased, right? And not only is it biased, but the bias may not be fixable. Both on ID and on affect recognition, right? We have a growing pile of evidence that shows that it's less good at certainly recognizing people with darker skin, women, gender non-conforming people, and again, a growing pile of studies there. And the assumption is we can fix it, but it's not at all clear based on, again, a growing pile of research that is at all going to be easy to do. And of course, fixing it also entails this hunger for data that has entailed really unethical practices in just getting more photographs. Everything from sort of tricking people into uploading their holiday photographs to using photographs of immigrants who never gave their consent and even abused children, right? Like, these are all real world examples of companies trying to hoover up more and more photographs in order to be able to train their face surveillance tool. And then it's not just about the bias in the tool itself, it's also the real world system, right, into which that tool is released. Every tool is released into a matrix of power, and this question came up on a panel yesterday, right? What do you mean that this technology can exacerbate, structural inequity? And an example from the criminal justice system is the fact that the comparison database that you're using for your system is often an arrest database. And we know arrests in the US are actually disproportionate to the biracial group, even though the underlying proportion of crimes may be similar, right? People of color get arrested at a disproportionate degree. So if you use that, right, you are actually amplifying the potential race impact of that tool. And the fact that surveillance cameras are often disproportionately located in certain neighborhoods, right? Maybe lower socioeconomic neighborhoods that are less affluent, as is the case in Baltimore, for example, or Detroit. And the fact that the operators of these cameras themselves may have their own unconscious biases, right? So various ways in which layers of inequity combine with the inequity within the tool itself to exacerbate those effects. Of course, face surveillance can be applied contemporaneously or after the fact to any still or moving image. Public or private, it doesn't matter, right? There's a lot of images, and with that volume, it turns out that it effectively means activity in most public urban spaces can be traced to that individual person. And this becomes even more problematic in the context of other systems that the government is building that intentionally, I think, blur the line between public and private surveillance, right? That these systems link your face profile to other biometric information, location, profile data, in some cases a national identity card that you would need to perform virtually any transaction, and also to automated decision-making systems that, for example, assign you, right, like a social capital score, a credit score, various kinds of scores that also govern, right, your ability to make various kinds of transactions in the world. And when you have that effect combined with a surefire identification of a person which cannot be escaped in public spaces, you shut down a great deal of protected activity, right? The Aadhaar card in India is a great example of this, right? It's a biometrically based card that now, I'm an Indian citizen, I don't have one, and every time I go back to Delhi, it becomes more difficult for me to make basic transactions that were easier previously because I didn't have to have this sort of a card. Project Greenlight in Detroit, another good example of this, which knits together public and private surveillance cameras. Federal US systems built by a company named Palantir, for another example, such as the Heart Ident database, is this one-stop shop, right, of supposedly all of your social media profiling, your biometric information, and even tools like Amazon's Ring video doorbell that actually part of whose business model is explicitly to connect to law enforcement and give law enforcement access to the data, right? And for which Amazon has filed a patent for facial recognition, not only of people in front of the doorbell, but to stitch together images of someone's sort of side profile who may just be walking by on the street. So a lot of reasons why face surveillance is particularly dangerous, and I think the end result is going to be the self-censorship of a lot of legitimate activity in public spaces. And we can talk more later about the counter movement to that, because I think people are recognizing that we've had a lot of surveillance technologies in the past, but this one has some unique powers that should make us all take pause.
Okay, I think if we go to Jason now, and maybe you could give your experience of protesting and surveillance in Hong Kong and how that's impacted on you.
So, just now, they have mentioned about the right to say no to face recognition, and you have a positive view on that. That we can say yes, because we can say no to face recognition, because with the assumption of democracy. But as the protesters in Hong Kong, which are fighting for democracy, we haven't have the democracy as a shield to protect us from facial recognition or protect us from the government using our biometric data to track us, especially in the protests. To us, AI is much more a tool to reinforce the balance of power. It's a tool for the rich to use by the rich or the power. The rich will get richer by using this tool. So as the one in power, it uses AI or like facial recognition or biometric data as a tool to consolidate their power. So it's very imbalanced to us as a opposed, as an citizens who like to rebel or against the government or to fight against the government in these circumstances. Like when we are during the protest, there's a lot of massive amounts of CCTVs being put in like the street corners or even on the lampposts, trying to track us by facial recognition. And for as a dangerous threat, it's not only a dangerous threat to democracy, but also a dangerous threat to people who are now fighting for democracy. And facial recognition is just a small tool in this part because it's just a small tool to track you. Even though you can escape from the facial recognition, you can't escape from other methods to track you, like the biometric data. We have recently talked to a professor a few days yesterday, and he has mentioned he has raised very interesting questions about the biometric data. As a protesters, we have masked on and put our hats on in order to protect our identity, so as not to track by the police or the CCP. But we have tried to raise our hands up and like that, as the photos shown, to symbolize that we are fighting for 5 demands. At the same time, we are exposing our biometric data when the government can use cameras to catch, to find out who you are by the fingerprint. So AI for us, for protesters in Hong Kong, our feelings is AI is a tool which mainly only serves for power. I'm not saying that we shouldn't develop AI, but in these circumstances, it will be much harder for us to express and protest against the ones with power. When AI has grown much stronger, as the AI and digital surveillance only works for the interest of the power and the richer people.
Okay, thank you. And Marco, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, like adding on to the arguments made by Jason, I mean, the concept of Panopticon proposed by Jeremy Bentham back in the 1970s is highly demonstrated in Hong Kong when the citizens are threatened by a large number of CCTV cameras and generate a high degree of white terror and self-censorship. And some of the challenges faced by Hong Kong citizens are that there are really no expertise, or there's a lack of expertise to disseminate the knowledge of AI or the use of surveillance and technology to the citizens. When there's like really linked to another challenge of there really like a low degree of social awareness towards the use of AI and their rights, their responsibility, or their responsibility as a citizen or as a governor to use AI to protect the city, to protect this, or to maintain the order of the society, as well as, for example, combating crimes, or for China, they and using surveillance or using technology to protect the sovereignty of the state. And one of the most highlight statement or the argument of the protest in Hong Kong is that apart from the creativity that has kept the movement alive another like element that keeps the movement ongoing is that the ability of Hong Kong protesters not being detected by or not being caught. So for instance, we use coins and notes instead of using like octopus or any like digital payment methods to pay for our like travel expenses or like from point to point. And we fear that the online footprint or the transaction footprint that we left on any transaction and payment method a platform, like they may give a clue or like to leave a track for the police. And yes, definitely the awareness of Hong Kong citizens are growing, but like it's still relatively low as a public population. And another point I would like to raise is that the government is trying to like make the terms ambiguous, and it's really hard for like the majority of the Hong Kong citizens, which are like especially to the low educated, the population, especially and in the field of technology, to fully understand and have a comprehensive view on how the technology is practiced in society and how is their responsibility and rights are protected. And another point I'd like to raise is that for example, and in the situation in China is that there are many more state-sponsored companies which have a really close interconnections with the state, and especially when you consider the scale of China, it's really hard to like monitor. But why can they achieve that? Is that they have a really well-established hierarchy with the aid of the province state, like the regional state, to help them build their own database and collect the biometric data. For example, the body fluid, saliva or the blood, like to help them to build a large database which can like impose a high degree of surveillance on the social lives, the daily lives of the people. So I emphasize that it's not only about the state, but it also the state-sponsored companies which help build or like to help to increase the degree of surveillance in the social daily lives of the people.
Like I would like to add on a little bit on that, on the examples. So what we recognize like facial recognition is mostly for commercial purpose, like Google for advertising or to sell you something, or for fashion, or even combating crimes. But to countries like China, so it's more than just combating crime, but a form of social control used in every part of the life. They have developed a system which uses it for education. They are putting a device on the child's on the student's brain to detect whether they are concentrating on the lessons. If the children isn't concentrating, their brain. The device will send a signal to the computer displayed in front of the teachers, so that the teachers can correct their actions. So you can see that facial recognition is just a small tool in terms of the social control, and China even puts it into even developed into a social credit system called the Sesame Credit System. It relates to every Chinese citizen's daily life by like detecting what they have done. If you are smoking in a non-smoking area, it may lower your credit, or even if you have said something against their party, it will also lower your credit. The lower of the credit will have a lot of consequences, because this system relates to every daily life. What I mean by the daily life is the way you need to use the system to buy a train ticket, maybe to pay for pay for a higher tax, maybe. Like it relates to every single part in your daily life. So it's a very strict control in China with the use of the system. And what we realize about the facial recognition or the process problem is just maybe a small part of that in terms comparing to the use of facial recognition and biometric data in China.
And Bogomir, you had an interesting point yesterday because you spent some time in China as to why this sort of control through technology is a necessity. Or
Yeah, I mean, I was actually just thinking about why Hong Kong protests were so popular in media. I mean, besides that it's extremely photogenic and that it had all these artistic tools being applied of, wearing a mask, using of lasers, building the brick sculptures on the street to interrupt the transport. Like it has all these qualities of high-end art in a way. But on the other side, I think what this protest is on one side for us is a good way to say how terrible China is and to project that everything that is going wrong with face detection and technology is somehow almost Chinese responsibility. But what I learned from watching crowds and from studying other examples of protest crowds, for example, 2 years ago there was a protest in Georgia where people danced in front of parliament. That protest there did not change much in Georgia, but it did motivate people in Berlin to organize an anti-fascist protest where 85,000 people gathered. So I think what's interesting about watching protests in crowds is that they somehow mirror itself. So the problem that Hong Kong has is also very much a problem that we are having, but somehow it's more camouflaged or more softened in a way. I think what China is, it's an extreme massive population of people where technology is employed to very fast train these people to reach certain level of behaving, proper behaving. And what I think is, let's say, to me as an immigrant from Serbia, I have to give up my privacy when I was moving to Netherlands. But nobody spoke about my face being lost. Nobody questioned when I go to London and I have to give this amount of papers to get visa, where they even ask who I'm gonna meet, why me, why not somebody else, how much I'm gonna get paid. Nobody asks about my privacy. When you send your passport to get British visa, nobody questions why am I sending my passport to Poland, where most of EU members would never do something like that. So I think, like it's sort of easy to tackle China because it's like an extreme of extreme. But I think this protest, as any other protest, it really shows a collective crisis. So yes, so that's my so yes, in a way I did feel quite stressed in China, but it's a lot because of actually not knowing really rules and not knowing really what's true and what's not. And which is exactly what surveillance does. When we walk through public space and we see surveillance camera, they're blinking, but half of them are fake. But we still obey them as if they are working. So we're looking also at the implementation of certain technology that comes with a lot of assumptions, where nobody really gives us clear understanding of what this technology is doing, and this easily also build up this self-surveillance, which is like the worst shape, where we actually surveil ourselves and surveil each other. So anyway, that was like a kind of a line. But the Hong Kong protest, it was like the most shared protest ever. This crowd of millions of people walking in the beautiful Hong Kong, filmed with drones, is like extremely powerful, biggest, one of the most interesting collective gatherings last decade, I guess. Yeah.
So you were saying, about white terror. You felt white terror in Hong Kong because of the surveillance. But did you also protested on the streets in Birmingham? Did you feel that same sense of white terror there? And why would you felt that there? Because obviously there's not the same type of surveillance system.
There were a few incidents happens to us as protesters in Birmingham, United Kingdom. Some Chinese they came to the scene and they push us, or like some even tear our mask away, tear our mask off. But the degree of surveillance in terms of technology use against or like towards us has been like much different, like a much milder level. But of course, statistically, when you consider the large number of CCTV cameras installed in the UK, its purposes or their purposes are not like directly towards us, or we are not the target audience concerning the use of technology. But in Hong Kong, when you consider the seriousness or the period of the social movement, the use of technology is like mainly against protesters. They treat us as crime, as a criminal. Everything we have done like are against the government, against the sovereignty, or like, against the basic or the bottom line of the Chinese government or the Hong Kong government.
Okay, so Jeremy, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just whispered. I want to offer one counterpoint, which is like related to this idea of, yes, as long as the state or people in power have access to this technology, probably we're all in big trouble. However, like as I stated earlier, there are many points in history where we fought back through really diving in and getting our hands dirty with technology and understanding it as citizens. And this is something that came up in conversation last night. I've been inspired watching people in Hong Kong actually manipulate the media, manipulate technology in the streets, just hacking technology with umbrellas. As an artist, you're sort of taught to understand your material, right? And so material of control here is worth understanding. I do want to offer one example of how that can actually result in significant change. So one of the largest art shows in America that happens every 2 years is the Whitney Biennial. At the Whitney Biennial this year, there was a group of people called Forensic Architecture who decided to, within the exhibition, sort of take some of this technology and use it to protest the acts of one of the Board of Trustees members. This guy, what's his name, Candors or whatever. And this Board of Trustee member, anyway, is one of the people in charge of a company called Safariland. And Safariland makes tear gas and rubber bullets that have been used illegally in conflict zones. What they did is they took machine learning technology, the very technology we're talking about is used to oppress and control, and they used that to track the misinformation or the number of times these technologies of war had been used illegally, and so we're able to sort of like expose candors within the context of an art exhibition. And the social pressure got to the point where Candors had to resign from the Board of Trustees. But anyone who works in art, that was like kind of a huge win, because ultimately, like, it's really hard as the artist in an exhibition that's being paid for by, and you'd be surprised how many shows I've been in that are run by weapons moguls. But like, it's true. It's like a problem in the art world. The art world's fucked up. But to overthrow one of these weapons moguls in that context, using machine learning and using this technology that we're talking about, controlling us, it was an inspiring example for me that it's not so complicated that we can't all also get to, start to use it and misuse it against those in power.
So you wore masks in Hong Kong. What other sort of creative ways did you use to try and trick the technology?
You mean like what other ways can they
did
track
people
it?
wear makeup? Did people cover their?
Mostly people just masked it on, but the awareness of like facial recognition, the problem of privacy, isn't that high in Hong Kong. Although you can see a lot of protesters wearing the mask and putting their hat and gear on, but it's just to the awareness of like on privacy problem on these AI technologies is just because we are trying to protect ourselves. Like this is not like putting our mask on or putting some like drawings or like the one in the pictures or in the photos isn't effective way in preventing like facial recognition, because there are much more tools to track us, no matter by how to track the protesters' walk. Can be an important biometric data for the government or for the CCP to track us, because it has a successful it has been developed in China, and apart from that, our voice can also be recognized. So for us, we are trying to raise the awareness in protecting ourselves because of this protest. But you can see that even though in such a protest, we are trying to protect ourselves by avoiding the face recognition, there's so much that they can track us. So for me, or as a protesters, what I think is the stronger the AI, it's harder for us to fight back. And what these examples in Hong Kong and China example can inspire us is such a strict social control can actually happen in the West, performed by the companies which collect the data, but just in a form that in a more indirect way.
So Shankar, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to second that. I think that there is a tendency to sort of make China the boogeyman, but in fact, we are building largely the same kinds of infrastructure, and I think we have some over-reliance on this idea that the fact that our governments are democratic, right, or that our companies are supposedly more benign is going to save us, but that is really not the case. And I think in that context, I'd like to make the point that, even in our democratic societies in the past, safeguards have not worked to protect marginalized and vulnerable communities. In a panel over the last couple of days, I gave the example of the Muslim community post 9/11, which was subjected to a years-long campaign in those post 9/11 years of warrantless, suspicionless surveillance that failed to catch a single terrorist and was later struck down as unconstitutional, right? So the whole thing was illegal, but of course that didn't prevent the surveillance from actually happening and having its impacts on the community, right? So they used license plate readers near mosques, for example, to track people who were coming to and from mosques, and people expressed that made them feel very uncomfortable about going to this place of worship. And I think this leads to the point that I think has been implied over the last few days, that the harms of facial recognition in particular are speculative. And I think they're not only based on extrapolation from all of this long history of other surveillance technologies, but in fact, facial recognition itself has already been misused to impact these marginalized and vulnerable communities. And I'd like to give you a couple of examples of that. One is Seattle recently became the first city in the U.S. in which our port commissioners actually raised a barrier to the implementation of public facial recognition in our airport, SeaTac airport, right? Every other airport just sort of lay down and said, go ahead and do it. And technically this is a federal jurisdiction, although the interesting thing that's happening is the airlines are actually implementing facial recognition for the federal government, right? The airlines are doing sort of the dirty work in exchange for access to the data, right? So there's this semi-unholy deal happening between the airlines and the port. And there has also been a history in the past of Customs and Border Protection coming to the airport to pick up undocumented people who are there to pick up their relatives, right? So now in the context of this new deployment of facial recognition, what people representing immigrant communities and the Latinx community are saying is, we don't want to come to the airport, right, if there's any possibility of facial recognition being used in the same way to find undocumented people. A second example is in Washington State. Again, using examples that I have personal experience with, there are probably many more, but Washington State in 2012 became one of the first states to implement a facial recognition-based fraud detection system in our license database, right? Intended to basically not allow someone to use someone else's picture to get a license. And this was in part because Washington was one of the few states that didn't have a citizenship requirement for licenses. And it was supposed to be used only for that purpose. We actually put that in statute back in 2012. Guess what? Years later, we get a disclosure in which it turns out that the federal government has been making requests for years to Washington State to use their facial recognition system to find undocumented immigrants. So various federal agencies, including ICE, made these requests, and the Department of Licensing actually used that system to try to find these people for the purposes of immigration enforcement. So I think the lesson learned there is, you can have all of the benign purposes you want for your facial recognition system, but you actually have to plan based on mission creep, right? And to assume that if the system is there, the safeguards may actually not work to prevent the uses that go beyond those benign purposes. And I think that's a really important reason why we need that mechanism to be able to say no if that's indeed the direction that our democratic society is moving us in.
Do we have 2 minutes to round up? Do you want to come back to the creative side of
well, yeah, I mean, it's like I actually always mention that Faceless became like a curse. What was supposed to be a cool project that I did in 2013 and then moved to something else. It just doesn't stop because the amount of images and how this narrative is developing is just growing. And also there's a certain responsibility, especially in educational like in art academies, there are students coming and producing these images again and again. So it's kind of interesting to give some context, and especially look in the way how the new technology is actually evolving around the face, hoping to actually have some solutions to maintain some kind of facelessness in contemporary society. Yes, but basically, I mean, what for me is interesting, there's two different projects that I've been working on. One is like looking into the ritual of dancing in time of social political crisis, and this is, let's say, the ritual of masking, because it is a very archaic form. We put a mask and we become a collective body. We put a mask to turn ourselves into something else. So it's a very ritualistic, actually, setup, just in a very high-tech environment. So for me it's interesting actually what I think will be next. That's this aspect of how technology choreograph us. So not just how we facially express ourselves, but also how we walk, how we sit, what will be, I don't think that we're just gonna mask ourselves with, having this proper behaving when we walk through public space. I think it's gonna go to next level where we maybe will not even show our emotions anymore, or train ourselves to just be, cold and frozen, like in sci-fi movies, with the perfect posture, straight neck, healthy looking bodies. And what's also interesting, and it was mentioned, that surveillance goes in this direction of even tracking the way how we move and recognize us by walking. Just a simple example, the iPhone headphones, those white ones, wireless. I mean, if you go to cafes now where all the cool kids are sitting, you will see that they sit totally different, like the posture is different. So this small integration of technology just in their ears is already changing their bodies and the way how they behave. Just a small, the most plastic, simple, superficial example, but yeah, I think next would be these two rituals coming together, so masks and dance, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so are there any questions in the last 5-10 minutes? No? Okay.
Should I stand? Okay. Hi, Jesse Wu, Alita Consulting. I'm curious about if any of you have looked at like bans on face masks. I mean, Hong Kong is a prominent example, but also in the U.S. we have in the American South, a long tradition of these bans, supposedly to combat the KKK, groups like that. But if any of you could speak to that, that'd be interesting for me.
Yeah, sure, I can actually. So it's interesting that you mention Ku Klux Klan, because when it comes to the protests today, you also have a lot of hoodies. So I've been researching the history of hoodies, which actually starts from the hoodie as a garment, but then when you translate the word into hooded, then you go into the Ku Klux Klan witches and all the historical examples of hoodies. So it's interesting because hoodie is maybe the most democratically shared way of keeping privacy in public space. At the same time, hoodie in States or in UK has a very particular socio-political tension. When the person of color is wearing hoodie in States, you have this kind of tension. There were like murders, there was the Black Lives Matters movement that started from that. In UK, hoodie is a kind of reaction to socio-political inequality. So for me, hoodie is also in a line with a mask very much. And it's equally hated and discussed as actually burqa as well. And there is a public ban on burqa too. And then there is a public ban on masks. So some countries did it a long time ago. Some countries like Netherlands, Austria, Canada, with the rise of Pussy Riots, Anonymous movement. So the ban is not only in Hong Kong, the ban is internationally. So it's, again, we're talking about global problem, we're not talking about the local problems. And but in Asian culture, wearing a mask, which for Westerners always seems as if the person thinks that we are dirty or unhealthy, is actually to protect the other from spreading flu or bacteria. So it's sort of interesting to see how different cultures understand the mask and what it means to hide the face. But yeah, the ban is internationally spreaded, and it goes really in a line with hoodie and with balaclava and burqa together.
Okay, so Shankar, you want to talk about the regulations?
Yeah, and to the question that was asked, I mean, I think you know, our position has been that banning face masks is actually an unconstitutional form of suppressing free speech, right? And the right to free assembly and protest under the First Amendment. So, you know, I think that's a relatively easy one. But on the much broader scale, you know, the question of bans and moratoria is actually becoming much more mainstream, I think in part through the work of groups like the ACLU. You know, Somerville and Cambridge and Seattle have considered bans, and in fact, San Francisco became the first jurisdiction to actually ban facial recognition. And you know, I think that there is going to be a lot of push and pull in this space, and one thing I wanted to make sure to highlight was, you know, there's a panel at 10 a.m. today, for example, about regulating facial recognition that was organized by Microsoft. And I've heard all of these calls for regulation. Well, the very fact of calling for regulation skips over the yes-no question, right? So that's one sort of aspect of that. I think it's also the case that there's a big gap, particularly for big tech and, you know, Microsoft and Amazon in particular, about what you really mean when you talk about regulation, right? I think we engaged directly through our coalition of impacted groups with Microsoft and Amazon senior leadership, you know, a couple of years ago in 2017, and you know, we got a lot of the right noises back. You know, there was acknowledgement of the dangers of facial recognition technology, but I think the best evidence we have of what those companies mean when they say regulation is the actual bills that they have introduced, and particularly the bill that they've introduced in Washington State, which they have been calling the Washington model, you know, and want to spread. And I think the idea there is essentially the widespread legitimization of both public and private face surveillance. You know, private face surveillance largely with signage, right? So if you're a business, you put up a sign, go ahead, right? Use facial recognition all you want, because people, in theory, have notice. Of course, if every business is doing facial recognition, right, then you may not really have a choice about whether you can avoid it or not. And on the public side, I think it's even more pernicious because, it goes back to these ideas that have been expressed over the last couple of days that, for example, requiring warrants is somehow going to save the process of facial recognition. Well, this bill is even more broad than that. It allows warrantless, suspicionless face surveillance in protests, just on a street, around places of worship. The only thing it really takes off the table is sort of following a specific person over a period of time without suspicion or a warrant, right? So a very narrow slice is taken off the table. Everything else is left on. And I think it's worth asking the hard questions, right? When entities say, we want regulation, that initially sounds like a good thing, but when you actually look at the regulation, it turns out it's more of an industry capture move that allows more of these tools to be sold and legitimized because now they have the stamp of having been considered by the legislature and given the green light.
Okay, thanks. A question? No?
It's on. Okay, now it's on. I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about also the countries where we don't actively have a protest movement, like Belgium or the Netherlands, that are considered okay, but still in the Netherlands you have these soft type of measures where your taxes can only be submitted online, and in Belgium you cannot buy gas with cash unless you go inside and they have all the cameras. So how can you remain faceless or even just offline in those situations where you cannot move by car because you can't buy gas and you can't submit your taxes in person or by post, but only online?
Well, yeah, that's this exactly contradiction of looking into China and speaking about things, about culture and country that most of us never went and don't understand, while where we live, actually, we are beeping 24/7. I mean, I live in Amsterdam, and I literally don't remember last time when I had cash in my hand. And then suddenly, we discuss how people in China pay through WeChat while I'm using the Apple Pay on my iPhone, where I communicate through WhatsApp and I invite people to my event through Facebook. So it's a little bit of hypocrisy of, I'm afraid, of a Western perspective. And yeah, I mean, I think it would be much more interesting to actually look into what's really happening around us and then try to kind of compare that and maybe actually really have a little bit of, yeah, I don't know, like, but this is a hypocrisy of...
I just want to point out one other hypocrisy, though, which is that this is like potentially a lot of white people with privilege are getting a little bit nervous because they're going to be under the same social constraints as many of the marginalized groups have been for centuries. But the fact that you can't go buy gas and and that you're going to be tracked it's a privilege that you've had that right to privacy, historically speaking, anyway. So just if you were a gay man in the 1960s, let's go back to that post-war period. You had to live in a subcultural kind of refuge, right? You had police coming to stop you from dancing, right? And protest movements arose from a different type of machine learning or different type of face tracking called each of you in the audience here, who has a very important role to play in creating a more inclusive society. So I think everyone on this panel is reflecting that. I really don't think it's a technical problem. I think it's a social problem, personally. That if we don't take up arms socially and say this is what we stand for socially, inclusive societies, then we're going to continue to reproduce the same expropriation that we've reproduced for centuries, which is, it's very convenient for us to enslave people with less, right? It's very convenient for us to celebrate our 16-year birthday party, with opulence, because we are allowed to do that because we stole and we killed millions of people. I mean, not to make it absurd, but it is kind of absurd. And the countervalence has been absurd over the years. If you think about the gay population, drag was the primary mode of fighting, one of the modes by which they fought back, right? It's so you're gonna tell me I'm not allowed to express who I feel I am. I'm gonna go to absurd lengths to the opposite, and I'm gonna dress up with great opulence and great femininity, right? And I think through those acts of absurdity, though I might seem like a clown on stage, you are able to get people realigned around the social cause. And I think if we can realign around that, we'll be much better off.
And very briefly to the question as well, I think you're right to highlight these sort of soft ways, and in fact, one that a lot of folks don't question is the fact of smart cities, which are effectively, right, like a massive surveillance infrastructure that are being rolled out, right, under the guise of convenience, but in fact, in many instances are founded on this philosophy of over-collection of data and tracking of absolutely everything and hanging on to it, right? So I think, to sort of echo the point, I think, a values-based framework that also, and it can be a lot of different kinds of foundations that end up in the same place of these principles of, for example, data minimization, and actually even before that, justifying the supposed efficiency gains, right? And asking the tough questions about this infrastructure we're building and whether we will actually be able to live democratic, free lives in the presence of this massive infrastructure. And I think it's a lot of different things, and those questions rarely get asked because we're all subject to this narrative of innovation equals good, where innovation doesn't actually always equal good, right? Innovation is not necessarily a good in itself. Human welfare is the good, right, for which innovation has become the shorthand. And we actually have to question and make sure that there is a meaningful connection between those two before we say that it's even worth considering something like a smart city infrastructure.
Okay, I think we have to leave it there now. We've reached our end of our time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.